Hello everybody, welcome to More Chainsaws Needed, where, because I love horror, thrillers and suspense, I am going to talk, rant, rave about, review and recommend movies, TV series and books in those genres for you guys as I draw. House of Wax is a very odd duck in my list of great horror movies that were later remade. First, because it itself is a remake of 1933 Mystery of the Wax Museum. Second, because it was the very first 3D film with stereo sound to be released in theaters, and the first 3D color film made by a major American studio. And third, because the remake in 2005 is actually closer to being a remake of the frankly forgettable Tourist Trap from 1979. Intrigued yet? I hope you are, because we're going to talk not about the original Wax Museum of Horrors, but about the most remembered one, 1953's Andrea Tude's House of Wax. So let's talk briefly about the Mystery of the Wax Museum, which was considered lost media all the way up to 1960 and was not really restored and released to the public until the 80s. The story itself is pretty much the same we see in 1953, with the only difference that in Mystery of the Wax Museum we have three somewhat important ladies and two of them survive, while in House of Wax we have two named important ladies and only one of them makes it to the finish line. Now, a lot of sources I have found on the net, from Wikipedia to IMDb, credit the original plot to a short story by Charles S. Belden titled The Waxworks. But let's be clear right here. You are not going to find that short story anywhere, because it was unpublished. See, Belden did what many writers dream of doing with their stories nowadays. He sold it to a studio before he could sell it to a publisher or a theater company, because he had also written a stage play with the same name and idea. And upon finishing that business deal with Warner, he decided to stop shopping for an editorial so that the studios could have a somewhat original story that no one had seen before. Even if, well, let's be honest, the idea that the wax figures in the Wax Museum are actually corpses covered in wax is like one of the oldest urban legends, and unfortunately in a couple of times it has been true. Anyway, Mystery of the Wax Museum was the last two-color Technicolor film ever made, and because it was done before the Hays Code put some very strict lines that no director could cross, it managed to be incredibly creepy and dark, and included more than a few frontal naked torsos, although all of them were of wax figures and not real bodies. Mystery of the Wax Museum was a modest success on the theaters. However, by 1940, Technicolor had moved from the two-color film print to the three-color film print, and that movie was not one of those converted to the new technique, since most of the movies that were not converted were destroyed later. Mystery of the Wax Museum exists our story for now. Just one thing, we see that studios love to destroy negatives of films, so seriously, keep your media, keep it in physical storage, because we cannot trust the studios. We have learned that the hard way. Anyway, by 1953, Warner Bros. Needed a great movie to compete with the recently released Buona Devil, a year earlier. Because that movie was made in 3D, the studio insisted that the answer to that small independent movie had to be in the same format, because there's nothing that Warner Bros. Like more than following a trend. And they chose to remake Mystery of the Wax Museum, only this time they made it a period piece, moving the action from the then present day of the 50s to 1902. Ironically, the director they chose for the 3D film was Andrea Tude, who was blind in one eye and thus he could not actually see the 3D effects at all. However, according to Vincent Price, this may have been the true strength of the movie, because Tude was far more concerned with the story than with the gimmick. And he did provide a great remake from the original, while having to cut some of the most titillating and gruesome parts of it because, well, now we were in the Hays era, and thus all films were subjected to a bigger scrutiny, especially the horror ones. Now to the story. And I will use the House of Wax version because this is the story that we are discussing, and also because I could not find a copy of Mystery of the Wax Museum. Henry Jarrott is a very talented sculptor with a wax museum made completely by him. His specialty are historical figures, trying to make them as close as the real person as he can, but unfortunately his sponsor Matthew Burke keeps insisting that in order to make the museum a real success, they need to add a crime and torture chamber, as horror and blood is what really sells. We have heard that before. Jarrott, who sees his wax figures as his children, keeps disagreeing and even offers to buy the museum from Burke, but he will need 3 months to get the money as his possible new partner, Cindy Wallace, is off to Egypt and won't return until then, and back then there were no bank transfers on the internet. Furious, Burke decides to burn the museum down to get the insurance money, and when Jarrott refuses, Burke does it and leaves Jarrott inside to die after a brief fight. A year later, and despite the fact that Jarrott's body was never found and that there was a lot of evidence that the fire was arson, Burke gets the insurance money, but also gets stalked and killed by a disfigured man. His death is staged as a suicide, and the police doesn't investigate further. But a couple of weeks later, Kathy Gray, Burke's girlfriend, is also murdered. Her roommate, Sue Allen, sees the murder, but manages to escape from the murderer because she reaches the house of her friend Scott Andrews. What she doesn't know is that Kathy's body is stolen from the morgue that very night. As she is trying to figure out who killed her best friend, Scott, who happens to be Sidney Wallace's protege, finds out that Wallace knows that Jarrott survived and is now hoping to reopen the Wax Museum. Just as it was before, only that this time he will consent to modern sensibilities and allow for a Chambers of Horrors, and both Scott and Sue are invited to the opening of the museum. This is when Sue begins getting a very bad feeling about all this, because she notices that the Joan of Arc statue in the museum is practically identical to her deceased friend Kathy. You know how certain actors choose one role without knowing that it will shape their whole career forever? Like when Leslie Nielsen did Airplane, not knowing that that would be the first of many absurd comedies and spoofs to come? Well, that was House of Wax for Vincent Price. While he had done a couple of horror films in before, like The Tower of London in 1939, The Invisible Man Returns in 1940, and a small cameo of a voice in Abbott and Costello vs. Frankenstein in 1948, as was The Invisible Man, to be precise. Let's be honest, the last one hardly counts as a horror movie. It was not until House of Wax when he was rediscovered after a small hiccup in his career, and from then on he became the master of fright, that one that we know and love today, to the point of newer generations, well, they never knew that he did non-horror movies or non-villain roles, even to these days, decades after his death. So let's talk about Professor Henry Jarrott and what made him so special. We first meet Professor Jarrott before his descent into darkness, as a kind and talented wax sculptor who really dislikes the idea of using his art to make shocking and gross imaginary. This can be seen as a bit of commentary on one of the oldest arguments about popular art and what sells. Some, art critics in particular, decry horror as pure slog without any value, and Jarrott is on that camp. He wants to educate people with his friends, not make them faint. He wants to bring more beauty into the world, not nightmares. And so we can sympathize with him when he refuses his partner's ideas about the Chamber of Horrors, especially because the museum is not in the red. This is very important. The museum is not losing money. It's not making a lot of money, but it is not losing it. And thus we can see him at first as the hero of the piece rather than the monster. Except there is a tiny bit of darkness to Jarrott. And this is not just because he's Vincent Price and his face is now the face of horror and villainy. No, it's the way in which he talks about the statues, the way in which he seems to think they speak to him and are more valuable to him than human lives, which is a bit worrisome to say the least. Of course, it looks quirky when he's talking to Wallace and his friends about the museum and how he dedicates himself to make them as human-like as possible, so close to the real people when he has pictures to work from. But when he throws caution to the winds to save the figures from the fire before even thinking about saving himself and then, I don't know, calling the fire department, then we can start thinking that maybe he's a tiny bit obsessed with his own work, especially with the figure of Marie Antoinette. When we see him again, now in a wheelchair but otherwise perfectly healthy except for having lost the fine motor skills of his hands, we can't help but feel bad for him. He can't recreate his lost friends on his own, and he has had to hire two assistants to help him recreate his collection. As a side note, one of them is then unknown Charles Bronson, originally credited as Charles Buczynski, which makes this movie really weird to see if you also happen to be an action film fan. Anyway, the problem is that as nice as Jarrod seems now, well, his murderous partner Burke has been killed. And while everybody in the universe thinks he killed himself, we know he was killed by a man with a deformed face, and more importantly, we know that suicides are not shock value, not even in them. So it's very convenient and strange that the very first figure for Jarrod's newly created Chamber of Horror is the suicide of Matthew Burke. One very interesting thing about the House of Wax, besides the fact that we seriously feel bad for Villain at first, and original audiences who hadn't seen Mystery in the Wax Museum might have even thought that Jarrod was not the killer. Sorry if this is a spoiler, but it is both Vincent Price and the movie that premiered 71 years ago, so I figured you already knew this. It is that the most proactive character, just like in The Fly, is a proposed damsel in distress. Sue Allen is first introduced as an absolute failure. She's unemployed, although it is implied that this is because she refuses to be sexually harassed by her bosses, which makes her quite progressive for her time, and has to depend on her friend Cathy, Charity, to make rent. When she sees Cathy being murdered, she flees the scene and runs to the home of her not-quite boyfriend, Scott Andrews, looking for the protection of a man. But it also means that she ends up homeless because without Cathy, no one is willing to help her stay in her apartment, which is also now a crime scene. So she ends up living with the Andrews family too, and yet you don't feel her as helpless or as if she was taking advantage of the man. More importantly, once she's feeling safer, she doesn't just wilt and wait for Scott to protect her. Although she accepts his invitations to go out to a can-can club and mentions how terrible the show audiences can be waiting to look at girls' underwear, which again, it is actually progressive for a woman in that era. Not the sex repulsive part that Puritanism has existed always, but the fact that she was criticizing the man who was effectively paying her bills. But anyway, also, yeah, the can-can scene is just there because of the 3D. But she is the one who doesn't let the cops convince her to stop investigating what happened to her friend's corpse that, as I said, was stolen from the morgue, and she wants to know what happened and why. She begins her investigation when Scott takes her to the opening of Jarrod's new wax museum, and she immediately notices that the new Joan of Arc sculpture is identical to Katie. While the cops had noticed another figure similarities to a missing deputy attorney, they had accepted Jarrod's excuse that he just took inspiration from pictures on the newspaper on both cases, and since both looked like the subjects that he was trying to replace, well, that is how they look like them. And that's enough for the cops. Not enough for Sue, who immediately finds a way to check Joan's sculpture a bit closer and realizes that the statue has her ears pierced. Something that the real Joan of Arc would not have had, but Cathy did. Also something that should have been covered by the wax, but that's, nitpicking. Even Jarrod being incredibly creepy when asking her to model for a new Marie Antoinette doesn't make her back down for her suspicions or investigations. While Scott just scoffs at her suspicions because he eagerly wants to take a job with Jarrod as an assistant and apprentice sculptor. And of course, Sue's investigation reaches the point when she manages to get close enough to John's sculpture to take off her brown wig and see the blonde hair of her friend Cathy underneath because no one thought about shaving her. While from that point on, Sue becomes strictly a damsel in distress, She's captured by Jarrod, so now we have the iconic scene of her hitting his face until the wax mask he was wearing to hide his deformities break, and the cops actually are the ones who saved her and Scott because they had kept investigating the missing deputy attorney case and caught one of Jarrod's accomplices with a watch belonging to the deputy attorney, because back in the 50s, in the beginning of the century, cops weren't as useless as they are now in horror. But still, the fact that the cops saved her doesn't change the fact that Sue did much more than just faint a scream at the mere hint of violence, and that is a very interesting trend that we remember also from The Fly and the original Invasion of the Post People. While the horror maiden who faints and trips and just keeps in her man's way is a stereotype of horror, especially of all horror, we can see that, at least in the 50s, this was actually not the norm. Or at least not the norm in the classic movies that we still remember and love today. House of Wax is a great movie and an excellent example of a remake that overshadowed the original completely. Although one may say it had some extra advantages given that by the time it premiered, Mystery of the Wax Museum was lost media and it would be a long time before it resurfaced. Thanks to the not quite remake of House of Wax of 2005, which we will talk about in the future, and well, if you get the DVD of that, you will get Mystery of the Wax Museum as an extra, if I remember correctly. However, if you want to see an incredible performance by Vincent Price, and as I mentioned it briefly, the very first time we saw Charles Bronson before he became a house name on his own, House of Wax 1953 is the movie for you. I want to thank my dear patrons Mitch Hyman, Elaine Ho, Jessic, Ellie Riley, and writer Philip Leto, as well as my first supporter Tania Pineda and the most amazing Amy Sunk, without whom none of my videos would be possible. I also want to remind you that if you want to support this and my other projects and get your name mentioned here, you can do so at patreon.com/Adalisa, written link on description, as I know my name can be hard to spell, and with just $1 a month you will always be thanked in my videos, as well as get access to a ton of art before anyone else, and get the chance to suggest future subjects for this. You can also support me through Ko-fi, and for each coffee you will get mentioned in 3 future videos. If you can't support me this way, I also accept likes, subscriptions to the channel, and of course, you sharing the link. I will also welcome all your questions, feedbacks, and suggestions in the comments below. This was Adalisa Zarate, and remember, there is not a problem in the horror genre that cannot be solved with more chainsaws.